Last major step in the build, full hydro steering. Here we go. All right, guys. For those of you who are not totally familiar with how a full hydraulic power steering system works, let me try to give you a little explanation. So just like in any power steering system, you've got a reservoir full of fluid. That fluid flows down to the power steering pump. Pretty standard stuff so far. Now the pump sends the fluid to the orbital valve, and this is where everything changes. And the orbital valve is kind of the heart of a full hydro system. So the orbital valve receives left and right steering inputs from the steering wheel through a shaft. Now this is where the mechanical connection in the steering system ends. There's no more mechanical linkage to the front wheels. The orbital valve, with the left and right inputs from the steering wheel, sends fluid down to the steering ram, which actually pushes the wheels left and right. So it sends fluid to the left or the right side of the ram, depending on the inputs that it's receiving. After the fluid is done in the orbital valve, it continues out to the cooler, and then back to the reservoir, and the whole cycle just keeps going. Now I have here on the table the components of the system that aren't yet on the vehicle. I've got the cooler, the reservoir, and the orbital valve. The orbital valve is going to go down here on the driver's side frame rail, right about there. My plan so far is to stick the cooler out here, actually on top of the front bumper. And the reservoir is actually going to mount up right about exactly where the factory reservoir sits. And of course the steering ram is still sitting under the vehicle, mocked up on the axle. And then my power steering pump is right there. So getting these components mounted up in the vehicle probably isn't going to be too difficult. My main concern is running the lines so that they are in good places that are safe and not rubbing or hitting anything else, and also the fittings that I'm going to need to use to connect all of these components, and especially at the power steering pump. That is the factory power steering pump, which I know will work in the system because it's been done before, but getting it hooked up and connected with everything else, that might prove to be a challenge. So the first thing I'm going to do is get this old power steering reservoir out of here, and then get the PSC power steering reservoir mounted in here. Now I am going to mount my reservoir in this location using the bolt holes that were for the factory reservoir, just because it's super simple to do it that way. So the PSC reservoir looks like this. It's got two holes back here for bolts, and so this is just going to have to sit in here like this, and like I said, I got to make a bracket to hold that up right there. So I came up with some pieces here for a bracket. Cut out some not quarter inch steel, 1/8 inch steel. This one will go on the bottom. This will be the part that the reservoir bolts to, and then some gussets. So I'll get that welded together and get it in the vehicle. Alright, so there's that. That will definitely work to hold up this reservoir. It's still super hot, that's why I'm touching it with these pliers. So, yeah, it's about perfect, right? So, I'll get this cleaned up and throw some paint on it and call that good. There it is, bolted in, and that's how the reservoir is going to sit in there. It's at a nice level, about as high as I can get it, which is what you want. So, pretty happy about that. Another part of the reservoir I forgot to mention is the vent. So at the top here, there was a hole here in the cap, but there's this fitting, and I ran this hose down here, And right here is a vent, which I bolted to the body. But interestingly, this vent allows the reservoir to pressurize itself up to 6 pounds per square inch, 6 PSI. Interesting. And then also, I called PSC. I thought maybe that this vent needed to be installed above the level of the top of the reservoir, but they said no. As long as you've got a little bit of a P-trap with the line, then it should be all good. All right, guys. Well, the next item of concern is this cooler. The fluid goes through here after it's done its thing in the orbital valve and goes back to the reservoir. This cools it all down. This was supplied by PSC. It doesn't look like a little miniature radiator like some coolers, but it's got tons of surface area, and I think it'll probably work the best, so I'm gonna make it work. Now, this can't go under the hood because it's hot under the hood, so it wouldn't be good to put it under there. And it's kind of hard to find a place to put this because it's kind of large. So what I'm gonna do is stick it out here on the bumper, actually, right above the winch, where it's gonna get tons of good airflow and it's out of the way of everything. So it seems like a good option for me. This cooler's got 4 mounting holes built onto it, 2 on each side, and I'm gonna again cut up some 1/8 inch steel to make my brackets to mount onto the bumper. So here's what the brackets turned out looking like. There it is, bolted to the cooler. And so it's just gonna sit on the bumper like that. So I'll go get a glue down there right now. Gotta see if the grill still fits with it on there. Oh yeah. No problem. So that's what that's gonna look like on there. I like it. My lines will run through here pretty easily, I think. So it'll all be good. I'll throw some black paint on these. All right, now that the cooler is mounted, our next challenge is gonna be the orbital valve, and it's gonna sit right in this neighborhood right here on the frame rail. And of course it's got an input shaft here, and here's the shaft from the steering wheel. Now you can see that this steering wheel shaft is at kind of a steep downward angle because the rack and pinion used to be in that direction, but now we've got to get it up here. So I've got to change the angle of this shaft coming off the steering wheel a little bit. All right, so this is what I just showed you on the firewall. This was attached to the firewall, and this little intermediate joint, our intermediate shaft, came out like that and pointed down like that. So to fix that, Trail Gear has this panel that's actually made for a Tacoma, so it doesn't actually quite line up with the holes on the one for the FJ Cruiser, but you can see the difference in profile. The hole points more straight rather than pointing down, and then there's this seal right here that'll go in here, and as you can see, it pretty much, well, it matches this one in here, so the shaft will be sealed. So now I just need to figure out how to adapt this to fit where this was. All right, never mind. Forget about adapting this thing. That was going to be way too difficult. So I just made my own plate patterned after the old one, and I took this ring out of the Trail Gear part, and I'm gonna put it in my new plate. So this is what it looks like underneath, inside. Here's the shaft coming out of the steering wheel. You can see, and this shaft doesn't bend at all. It's totally stationary. So my new steering shaft is gonna come from here and go through. So I'm gonna bolt my plate, or place my plate on the other side here. It bolts on from the outside, and then figure out where I need to put my hole in the new plate. And it turns out I won't be reusing this intermediate shaft at all. So now that this is in here, I can see where I'm going to have to, well, approximately where I'm going to have to put a hole in that plate. But I really need to get my orbital valve mounted out here so I can tell exactly what angle I'm going to want going all the way back to the firewall. So here's the orbital valve just sitting in here with the brackets supplied from PSC. I'm going to mount a plate to the bottom of this and weld that to the frame. That's how that's going to work. But right now it's just sitting here. I am going to mount it with my outlets on the side here and then run my lines down around the frame here, just 3 of them, and then the cooler line will actually run up through here. But yeah, space is pretty restricted. I got my alternator here. I don't want to squeeze that in so tight that I could never change it. I could move my orbital valve forward a little bit, but I've got this AC line right here that it would be dragging against, and there's a wiring harness here, radiator hose, oil lines, just a bunch of stuff up there already. So I think right about in this location is going to be where I end up. All right, so here's the bracket as I made it. I modified it a little bit, trimmed it here and there, made some reinforcements, got my plate in here and some space to weld. So I think that'll work out great. I had to extend this wire a little bit to make room for the orbital valve. It's just a ground wire for the main harness here. So I'll throw my orbital valve in here and see how it looks. All right, there it is. It looks good, but it's not good. I screwed this up. I started bolting up the orbital valve, and as it got tight and snug up to this, it lifted it up and kind of squared it up, and it's actually touching the alternator, actually this wiring harness. It's pretty hard, and I know the engine moves back and forth when it's running, so that is not going to work. I'm going to have to move my bracket out, oh geez, probably less than 1/4 of an inch, maybe 1/4 of an inch, and then it'll be fine. But yep, screwed it up. I gotta fix it. And yeah, I welded it on because I got overconfident, and it's not looking fixed yet. All right, it's not pretty, but I got it off. So now I'll just start the process of grinding this, making it smooth again. I'm sure I can salvage it. And then also not looking too hot there, but it's just steel, so we can fix it. All right, guys. Well, this looks a lot better. Lots better. Totally saved. No problem. The nice thing about working with steel is that you can usually fix it. I mean, you just cut it and weld it, and you can cut it and weld it and make it all better. And that's exactly what I did. And it looks great now. I've got at least I've got a good finger width between the alternator and the, well, actually this, not the alternator itself, but this harness. A good finger width between the valve and the harness there, so I think we're good there. My my shaft here is great, and I think that'll work out. I've got it, I didn't weld it fully this time before bolting it up, and I think that'll be a lot better this time. All right, next up in the steering system, I've got this telescoping shaft. This goes from the steering wheel to the orbital valve. It's got a U-joint on both ends that have splines and are keyed to fit the shape of the shaft. So I'm gonna have to cut this to length quite a bit, I think, but I'll make it fit. So as I'm installing this steering shaft and U-joints and all this, it's really become important for me to be able to rotate this steering shaft that's connected to the steering wheel. Now, one thing about full hydro steering is that since there's no mechanical connection to the wheels, there's no steering wheel center anymore. So the steering wheel is going to be able to spin endlessly. And yeah, it'll never be centered. No big deal. But I do need to pull out this airbag here and see if I can disconnect the whatever wiring is in there. I've never looked inside this airbag setup, but whatever wiring is in there that's might constrict the steering wheel from turning, because it's not supposed to turn endlessly. And a clock spring, that's the word I was trying to think of. See if I can disable that clock spring that's in there. So clock spring in a modern vehicle probably isn't actually a good name for it, but there's a coil of wire back here that allows you to turn the steering wheel while it stays connected to its electrical connections beyond the steering wheel. And as you can see, we turn the steering wheel 1, 2, 3 turns, or almost 3 turns. You hit there's a wire in there. That's actually what's stopping it right now. And I've got to get that out of there. And same in the other direction. You reach the limit of that wire right there. So I guess I got to get that out of there. So I pulled off these covers here, and you can see this is how this works. It turns with the steering wheel. So you can turn all the way around, and your wires, they don't have to break. And it looks like it's just held in with 4 tiny little screws on the corners. And then it's got 2 electrical connectors at the bottom. I think it'll come right out. All right, so actually I'm going to keep this thing in here, but I disassembled it. And here's your here are the wires. Here's what they look like inside the so-called clock spring. That's it. They're inside this housing. And the reason I'm going to keep them is because they actuate this right here that turns, which actuate your turn signal. When you turn the wheel, it clicks it on and off. But I pulled all the wires out of here so that this mechanism will be free spinning inside the steering wheel. So now my turn signal will still work. If I turn on my turn signal, I'm turning right, and clicks off. See? Perfect. Turning left, and boom. Just like new, but custom. And here it is, put all back together. So like I mentioned before, these U-joints from Trail Gear are intended for an old Tacoma, like a 96 to something else. Can't remember exactly. But on the inside here, you've got solid splines that go all the way around. No breaks in those splines at all. Now those dirty dogs at Toyota, on this shaft, they decided to put, hopefully you can see it, there's a solid right there and a solid right here where there's 2 splines combined. So this thing doesn't quite fit on there as is. I'm not sure what the correct way of taking splines out of this would be, but I am going to try using a file to take out a couple of these splines so that I can slide it down the shaft in there. This might take a minute. All right, I think I've got this. Victory. Now back to figuring out where to put a hole through this plate so that I can run this shaft through the firewall. All right, hopefully I put that hole in the right spot. I was just tacking in my seal ring there. All right, check it out. I got the hole in the right spot. That's about as close as I could ever hope to come. So now I just got to get that seal in there and then put it all back together again and finish welding that ring in. Here's my plate with my seal in it. I've got it all welded up and painted up, ready to go in the vehicle. And finally, the finished product inside and outside. All right, now that the full hydro stuff is all installed in there and set up, there's only one thing left to put inside the vehicle. And you know, you're thinking, what could it possibly be? I thought we had everything in there. Well, actually, I am going to install a brand new Toyota power steering pump. And the reason I'm going to install a new pump is that when I was up in Montana a long time ago doing trails up there, I blew out my power steering rack and I lost all my power steering fluid on a trail. I had to drive back to the trailer, which was at least an hour, maybe 2 hours. I can't remember exactly how long it was, but I drove it for a long time with no power steering fluid. And I think in that process, the power steering pump was damaged, because even after I installed a new power steering rack, sometimes I didn't really have any power steering assist, especially at idle. So I think maybe that power steering pump was damaged in that time that it didn't have any fluid. But we'll get a new pump in there, so it should be working at peak efficiency. And I'm also going to throw on a new belt, a new serpentine belt, because I'm pretty sure the one that's in there is from 2010, and that's too old. And fortunately, access to the power steering pump is really super easy right now, and I think there's only 2 bolts holding it on, so I just gotta take the belt off, take out those 2 bolts, a couple clips, swap this thing out and put the new belt back on, and I'll be back in business. And I was right. Only 2 bolts holding this thing on, just like here and here. So pretty easy to get out. And the new one going in. All right, the new power steering pump and belt are on. While I had the old belt off, I did check my idler pulleys, which are known to kind of go bad on FJ Cruisers, and mine were all good, so no worries there. So now that everything is in there, it's time to run lines all over the place. So my power steering fluid has a place to go. So like I showed you in the diagram in the beginning, I'm gonna go from the reservoir here, which bolts up right here, down to the pump, over to the orbital valve, down to the steering ram, and then back to the orbital valve, and then up to the cooler, and then back into the reservoir. So adapting the factory power steering pump to the PSC equipment turned out to be a little bit of a challenge. I went down to my House of Hose, where they make hydraulic lines and things like that, and they tried to help me out, but they couldn't quite, so I went to another place. There's a guy who does kind of specialty lines, and he TIG welds. And I was able to take this factory fitting off of the power steering pump, and he just TIG welded a connection on there so that I can connect this line from the power steering pump. So it's going to be seamless and pretty awesome. This line from the power steering pump, the high pressure line, is rated for 3,400 PSI. So that should definitely be good. The line from the reservoir down to the pump obviously is low pressure, so that's just a standard old hose. And then this line that goes from the orbital valve to the cooler is rated for 300 PSI. That should be sufficient. Yeah, I'll get these lines run and then show you how it turned out. So this system has, I think, just 2 different types of connectors in it. You've got your regular barb connections with a hose clamp, pretty standard stuff there. And then there's a bunch of these things that go onto the orbital valve and then down to the ram. And I'm just gonna show you really quick how you put these together with the line. So I like to just coat everything with some silicone grease because it doesn't have any negative impact on rubber. It won't make it swell or anything, but it helps everything on the line go together. So grease that up, and then just take this off here. And so you can see this line has a connection here, and then this is actually going to go into the hose. And then we just thread this thing onto the rubber hose counterclockwise, just till it stops. And then put a little lube on here, because this is actually going to go into the hose. And so we want to just slide in there real nice and be happy in there. And then just thread this in here, righty-tighty. And so this is going to go, this is clamped onto the hose that I just screwed on, and then I'm screwing this into the hose. So you get a nice leak-proof, high-pressure connection. And there you have it, ready to go onto the vehicle. All right, guys, well, the plumbing is complete. Now back to this factory fitting on the power steering pump. One of the other cool things about this is that I got to maintain this pressure switch right here. So when you're at idle and you turn the steering wheel and there's a surge in pressure, it'll raise your engine RPM a little bit automatically. That will be a great thing to still have intact. But yeah, here's the supply line coming down off the reservoir, and here's the pressure line that runs along this frame rail here under the radiator over to the orbital valve. And here's that pressure line on the other side from the pump going into the orbital valve. This is the line out to the cooler. These are the two lines to the left and right side of the ram down there. And yeah, when you tighten up these fittings, they don't turn. And I'm gonna tie up these lines down here and tie them together nice and tidy after I get everything tightened down and get the axle all painted and everything. But yeah, it's all done, guys. Oh, I almost forgot. Here's the cooler. Here's what it looks like coming out up on the bumper. I think it's pretty great. The line, actually, I ran it through these open spaces down here and down here. And these are actually where the impact sensors for the airbags used to be. I just took the impact sensors off so I could run these lines through here, because I'm not going to have a functional airbag system anymore anyway. So it's a perfect place to run some lines. All right, guys, like I said, it's done. And I'm not just talking about those lines. I'm talking about this build. All I have to do now is get this front bumper painted, and then get it back, take it off, paint it, put it back on the vehicle, and then bleed the brakes, bleed the power steering. Well, bleed the brakes, put the wheels back on, then bleed the power steering, and this thing's gonna be back out in the wild. So I have to say sorry for missing you for a couple days, a couple video days I skipped because I was busy getting a ton of work done here, not just the steering that I showed you in this video, but underneath I did a bunch of painting, finished painting all the skid plate stuff, doing my welding underneath there that wasn't finished, some miscellaneous gas tank things, just a bunch of little things that I've been tidying up, so this thing is ready to go. So thanks as always for watching, guys. I really appreciate it. Thanks for sticking with me through this long build. It's been a crazy adventure, but it's finally coming to a close. And I got to get out of here before it snows too much, or else I'll be snowed in. If you live in the U.S., happy Thanksgiving, and we'll see you next time.